Friends, welcome to the program. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning, and you're listening to Dollars and Cents, Central Florida's longest running radio program. This week's program, we're going to talk about whether there is a battle of the sexes raging at your home. Oftentimes, married couples can find themselves with contrasting views of what they want their financial picture to look like. Everybody's different. Everybody's got different habits. And oftentimes we see a battle of the sexes playing out in homes across Central Florida. So we'll talk about what you can do to help remedy that battle of the sexes. Because here's the reality. If there's a battle raging about your finances, chances are it's taking a toll on your finances. Also on the program, we're going to talk about ways that you can maximize your Social Security. And then we'll slide over to the mailbag. It used to be a mailbag. Now it's an email bag. We've got a question from a viewer or a listener. And so we'll tackle that as well. It's a question about taxability of Social Security. And then, of course, we've got room for your topic as well on this program. All you need to do to join us on News Radio WFLA Orlando is simply dial on in the following numbers: 407-916-5400, toll free 1-866-916-5400. If you'd like, you can also send us an email. That email address is my first name, Joel. That's Joel, at a little A with a little circle around it, NelsonFinancialPlanning.com. Full name of our company, NelsonFinancialPlanning.com, in order to send us an email. So, is there a battle of the sexes raging in your home? It's interesting. When people come in to visit us for the first time and it's husband and wife, you'll often see a difference, a contrast of opinions and of styles. Maybe one is a saver and the other is a spender. Maybe one wants to be more aggressive with their investments. Maybe one wants to be more conservative. We typically see that. And unfortunately, most folks choose a couple of routes that simply don't work particularly well. There's route one, which some people choose, which is they just don't want to talk about it. It's a battle of the sexes. You don't want to get into it with your spouse, and so you just sort of ignore it. That's probably the worst case scenario. The other thing that we sometimes see happen is that they sort of go off and do their own thing, right? So this person who might be more conservative invests conservatively. They save. They've got a separate savings account that's their money. And then the spouse who might be more aggressive or more of a spender doesn't have anything in his savings account. So they kind of do a divide and conquer type of thing. That's a little bit better than the do-nothing strategy, but it's not nearly as good as the strategy of sitting down, talking it through, working it out, and coming up with a plan that's going to suit both of you. Because here's the reality. The reality is that your income in retirement is going to be a direct reflection of what that other person's income in retirement is. Your retirement is going to be a direct reflection of how your spouse managed to invest and save along the way. And most importantly, your tax return that you're going to be filing in retirement, and frankly now, is a joint tax return. Very rarely would you ever be filing on a married filing separate basis. it's going to be married filing joint. So you're sharing the tax return, you're sharing income in retirement, you're sharing all of these things, which is why it's so important that the plan look at the different things that can happen along the way. And one of the biggest things is, what does it look like if one passes away? Because then that's going to affect how much income you're going to have in retirement, because if both of you are collecting Social Security, someone's Social Security is going to go away when one of you passes away in retirement. And what goes away is usually the lesser one, or the lesser amount of Social Security benefit. And then there's a step up to the higher benefit, but that still means that you've lost income during the most critical phase of needing income, which is during the course of your retirement. That's where the investment side comes into play, right? Because that investment side has got to have some level of growth during your accumulation phase, that phase where you're working and ultimately saving money and accumulating it so that you have it for later on. That's where it's important to have a discussion about what's the overall investment approach during certain periods of time. And it may be that the way to solve the battle of the sexes is ultimately to come up with some compromise, but that's a much better way than ignoring or kind of going it your own way. I also think that on a philosophical basis, going your own way typically leads to resentment, and not that we want to get into marriage counseling, but you get the idea. So it's important to really look at that overall picture. And so if there's a battle of the sexes raging in your household, you really do need to sit down and kind of look at the what if scenarios that happen. What if one passes away? What if we're retired? What if one passes away? What happens? And where are we going to replace that income from? And then in retirement, taxes and inflation, particularly inflation on the cost of healthcare, are going to be major expenses during your retirement years. So how do we wind up addressing those and creating a plan? It really is incumbent upon trying to work through those what-if scenarios in order to make sure that there's a plan that's going to work for you. Don't let the battle of the sexes undermine your retirement. It's important to have those conversations and make sure that there is a plan that's going to work for both of you, because the reality is your picture in retirement is going to be based upon what both of you are able to accomplish during those accumulating years. You know what's worse than a battle of the sexes raging at the house? A battle of the trees. And we'll tell you more about that when we get back. Here on Dollars and Cents, this is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. You're listening to News Radio WFLA Orlando. Back, ladies and gentlemen, Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. Before the break, we were asking the question, what's worse than a battle of the sexes? We talked about the ways in which the battle of the sexes can wreak havoc on your finances if you and your spouse are simply ignoring the problem and doing nothing, or going off and doing your own separate thing. The far better option is to sit down and have a conversation, work through these difficult issues, because in retirement, the income that you're going to get and the overall retirement picture is going to be dependent upon how both of you do along the way during the accumulation phase as you're working and saving money for retirement. We pose the question, what's worse than a battle of the sexes? Or at least from our perspective, what we see playing out is a battle of the trees. No, I'm not talking about Stanford. I'm talking about family trees, particularly when the second marriages and children from prior marriages that play out. The battle of the trees can be far worse and far more devastating financially and emotionally when you have two different sets of people now that ultimately have very different opinions and perspectives. It becomes even more important to sit down and have that conversation. Get it all on the table, get it all on paper, and really make sure that you're able to work through these battles. Battles of the sexes is one thing, but battle of the trees, particularly when there's different family trees involved, can be even worse. So make sure, bottom line on all of this, make sure you're sitting down, having that conversation, getting it all out there on paper, and make sure that each has an understanding of what's going to happen and what the implications are. We see these battles rage far too often, and the worst case that you can do is ignore it or try and go your own separate way. Because in retirement, it's really going to be all about that combined picture if we're talking about a couple. And those are the important conversations to have. Speaking of important conversations to have, this past week, the Federal Reserve spoke, lowered interest rates by a quarter point, widely expected move at the end of the day. I would caution, and we've said this before, this conversation about the Federal Reserve not cutting interest rates enough or they need to cut them even more, I think the economic backdrop that we have in this country is one that's pretty strong. We've been talking about that now for quite some time on the program. When you've got historically low unemployment, when you have strong consumer spending, when you have corporations that are in perhaps the best overall financial condition that they've been in quite some time, that's not really a scenario that says that there is economic weakness around the corner. Understand that when the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates, they are concerned about that very issue. There's some other things that come into play, things like inflation and those kinds of things. But fundamentally, a cut in the interest rates shows concern about the economic picture around the corner. The concern that I have is that if they just continue to cut interest rates willy-nilly, then you're not going to have any ability to combat, from a fiscal policy perspective, a tougher economic period of time. So I think the Federal Reserve would do well at this point. Okay, fine, they cut it again this past week, but I think at this point, the Federal Reserve would do well to sort of just cool it for a little bit and see where that takes us. I understand the administration's position of wanting them to continue to cut interest rates, because remember, when the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates, that basically works as an accelerant on economic growth. And the stronger the economy is going to an election, the better off it is, obviously, for the incumbent. So the reality is, though, that the markets really did not reflect that strongly positively or strongly negatively for the week. Last week, the Dow was down about 300 points, which isn't a whole lot considering that the Dow's at around 27,000. And so the markets really did kind of have a bit of a muted reaction. At the same point in time, you also had some external headlines, particularly the drone strike of the Saudi Arabian oil facility. That also wound up being a headline event this past week. The biggest thing, though, on the interest rates is it cuts differently if you are a saver versus a borrower, right? Because if you are a saver and you've got a bunch of cash stashed in a bank account or a savings account or a money market account, I got bad news for you. Cutting interest rates is going to continue to push down the rate that you are getting on that money that is just sitting there. And this has been the problem for many years now. As a saver, you're really in a tough spot because you're not making anything for a return. So savers, this really cuts hard against you. If you're a borrower, then this isn't a bad thing for sure, because what that's done is that continues to push down mortgage rates. 10-year Treasury note, the yield 1.75%. Now, not that your mortgage rates are going to get down quite that low, but they're clearly back down in to the 3.5% range on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So if for some reason you missed refinancing 3 or 4 years ago when those rates were incredibly low, you've got a second opportunity. And I wouldn't wait on this one because you just don't know how those rates are going to play out over time. So get on it if you missed it last time, because a reduction in the rates helps you if you are a borrower. Unfortunately, if you're a saver, I don't have a good answer for you, because the reality is that your rate just got cut. You've got to start looking at different investments than just keeping your money in cash. And we'll talk more about this in the next segment, but it's not going into one of these products that talks about some higher interest rate, because you're never actually going to get that number. That's the annuity conversation. We spent a lot of time on that last week. We're not going to repeat that again this week, but that's the reality. Another interesting statistic that we came upon this past week, which underscores the difficulty of trying to time the market. If you look at the past 30 years, over the course of the past 30 years, the single best 12 months and the single worst 12 months for the stock market actually occurred within a 24-month period of time. We'll say that again. Single worst 12 months and the single best 12 months occurred within a 24-month period of time. Folks, if that doesn't underscore why it's so difficult to try and time the market, if you think you're going to know when to get in and when to get out, all it takes, remember, is to just miss a little bit of the market's movement one way or the other, and you have substantially undermined your return over time. Past 30 years, worst 12 months, best 12 months, all within a 24-month period of time. And that period of time obviously was from March of 2008 to the end of February of 2009. That was your worst period of time. And then your best period of time was March of 2009 through February of 2010. One of the many things that the media misses is they only fixate on the negative. They don't fixate on the positive. So during that time, and I remember it quite well, there was just a tremendous hysteria on the negative that bleeded over, as it always does, into that period of time when the markets were in fact actually going up pretty strongly. And unfortunately, what we see looking at the data for investor returns is that a lot of folks missed out on that subsequent 12-month period of time. So important to remain consistent on your investments. We're going to take a break here, and when we get back from the break, we're going to talk about how you can maximize your Social Security. All that and more when we return. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. You're listening to Dollars and Cents, News Radio, WFLA, Orlando. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the program Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning here on News Radio, WFLA, Orlando. This segment of the program, we're talking about ways in which that you can maximize your Social Security. And what often surprises people is just how much of a benefit Social Security will be in retirement in terms of the amount that you actually get. Now, there is a maximum amount that you can get because when you pay into Social Security, there's a maximum amount of wages that you earn that have the Social Security tax amount on them. For 2019, for example, that's $132,900. Okay? So if you make over that, then the amount of income that you're making over that doesn't boost your Social Security because it's not subject to Social Security tax. So that means then that there is a maximum amount that you could possibly ever get from Social Security. And that amount, of course, depends upon your age, because if you're 62, then you're going to be collecting it at a discount from your full retirement age, which for most folks right now, it's 66 or plus or minus. And then at age 70, there's a maximum amount that you can collect that would be more than that full retirement amount that you would get at, say, 66, because at 70 is where they cut it off in terms of being able to increase that Social Security benefit. Now, when you get your Social Security statement, the number that is on the front page of that, the upper right-hand corner, sort of the main number, that is the amount that you're going to get at full retirement age. Be careful, because depending upon what year you were born, that could be at 66 or 66 2 months, 66 4 months. Those kinds of there's a ongoing right now sort of a graduation of the age and when your full retirement age really is. But full retirement age, if it's 66, then that's the number, well, regardless of whether it's 66 or not, the number on the front page of your Social Security statement will, in fact, be your amount that you're going to get at full retirement age. So the maximum you can get this year at age 62, it's about $2,200, $2,209 for the year 2019. Age 66, it goes to $2,861. There's the difference in terms of if you take it early, it's subject to a permanent reduction. And then at age 70, it's $3,770. That's the $2,861 plus the 8% each and every year that you delay it. So those are the maximum numbers that you can get when it comes to Social Security. The reality is, and this is where we've got a little bit of a sort of a concern in terms of how most of the online calculations of Social Security we think are somewhat misleading. And the reason we say it's somewhat misleading is because all of those calculations that make the optimal calculator, they really do only focus on delaying it and living as long as possible in order to get the most amount of Social Security. Well, that's easy, right? I mean, if I could delay my Social Security and live as long as possible, of course it's going to optimize. But there's a very important consideration to put into that mix. And that is something that we say to clients all the time in the office is, well, you're going to have to get the money from somewhere. That's the reality. So if you delay Social Security and you're retiring, where is that money going to come from? It's going to have to come from somewhere. So that's why we think a lot of this online calculator stuff may be causing people to sort of draw the wrong conclusion on what's the best route with Social Security. We're gonna return back to this Social Security conversation, but we don't like to have our callers hold too long. So we're going to jump over to the call. We've got Dan. Hey, Dan, good morning. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Love your show.
Well, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. You and my wife, so that makes two.
My question for you is it better if you had cash in a savings account, like an online savings account around 2%?
Sure.
Is it better to keep it there or go to possibly like
I'm sorry, you broke up on that last part. Or go possibly to a what?
short-term bond fund?
Oh, that's a great question. I would lean towards keeping it on the cash. I think there's a lot of volatility that a lot of short-term bond funds can have. I mean, there with a bond fund, and even though you're short on a short-term basis, this is a little bit minimalized, but as interest rates go down, the bonds go up. As interest rates go up, the bond prices fall. I don't know that you're getting much of a difference. And obviously, you mentioned kind of using an online savings type of an account, which is where typically you wind up getting a little bit higher rate because they don't have the cost of the physical structures. There's a bunch of them out there. Simple, internet search will yield a host of names. But I just don't know that you're getting much more of a difference in terms of what you're going to be earning on that short-term bond fund. And of course, the short-term bond fund would not have the FDIC guarantee, the full stability on it. So I think the little bit extra interest rate that you're getting is probably not worth the potential volatility that could come with a short-term bond fund. But that's a great question, Dan. That's a close one. And typically, traditionally, you would go to that. But this movement on interest rates down to where you've got the 10-year Treasury at 1.75. If you're able to find a money market account or a cash type of an account that's closer to 2%, you're probably better off there. But that's a great question, Dan.
Okay, thank you.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks so much for calling in with that thoughtful question. That is something that a lot of savers are certainly struggling with in terms of the cost and, or not the cost, but the interest rate or the yield that they ultimately are getting on it. A short-term bond fund is not going to have the same level of security as just a pure cash account. So I would lean more towards the cash. It's interesting when we look at sort of what's happening on the fund side of things. If you look at like a mutual fund that would traditionally have a bond component in it, what's interesting, we're actually seeing where the bond component of those funds is decreasing and the cash piece is increasing. So that certainly seems to be what the professional money managers are doing, is that rather than have the risk associated with a bond or a bond fund in general, they are going more to the cash side. So I suppose I would advocate that as well on an individual basis as well. So unfortunately, that's part of the problem when you look at that more conservative side of things. Back to the conversation on Social Security, I think it's very important to understand that a lot of these online calculators are predominantly geared to what's the best result that you can get over an extended period of time. And that's an easy question. I don't need a fancy online calculator or a 20-page report to tell me that, hey, if you delay this and then live as long as possible in isolation, that's going to give you the highest amount of Social Security benefits that you're going to collect over the course of your lifetime. That's easy. The more difficult question is, okay, well then, where's the money going to come from if you delay collecting your Social Security? And that's the question that these calculators don't really answer when they're optimizing the analysis is they don't really deal with the fact of, well, the money's got to come from somewhere. So before you just say, well, I'm just going to delay on Social Security and all, you have to have a plan for where else it's going to come from. And if that answer is, well, it's just going to come from my investments, well, we would say, well, wait a minute. So you're going to hit your investments harder than you need to earlier in retirement and then delay the Social Security. We don't think that math and those numbers work out. So before you jump to the immediate conclusion of I'm going to delay it, make sure you have a game plan and have had a discussion about where you're going to get that income from as well. The other thing about Social Security in terms of how to maximize it out, remember, Social Security is based upon the average of 35 years of your work history. It's not based upon the high 5. It's not based upon the high 10. It's based upon an average of 35 years. So if you look back over the course of the past 35 years, and there were some years in there where maybe you were not working, or maybe it was a job transition year or something like that, and those years are low, as you continue to work now, then you are replacing those low years. So you really want to have a handle on the fact that it's really a 35-year work history proposition that determines your Social Security, and understand what those 35 years look like in your case, because that's what the average is. So if you got some zeros in there, then that helps to pull down the average. Not crazy dramatically because it's 35 years, but a zero is still a zero and it still hurts the average. So those are some of the ways to be thinking about Social Security and how to maximize it out in retirement, particularly looking at the 35 years. By the way, we also posted this article on our Facebook page. So if you're interested in reading more about some ways that you can maximize out your Social Security, certainly check us out on Facebook. Just simply find us, Nelson Financial Planning, and you'll find our Facebook page, and then be able to find the article that we posted this past week that talks about that very topic. We're going to slide to a break. When we get back from the break, we will continue the conversation. We'll go into the email bag and answer an email from Michael when we get back here on Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning on News Radio WFLA Orlando. Welcome back to the program, ladies and gentlemen. Dollars and Cents here on News Radio WFLA Orlando. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. You're listening to Dollars and Cents. We are Central Florida's longest-running radio program. We're thinking a little bit more about that question from Dan in the last segment about money market or savings-type accounts versus short-term bond funds. Another word of caution on the short-term bond fund side of things, those funds have a better looking return, particularly on a year-to-date basis, because as interest rates have gone down, generally the bonds would float up. So that's making their year-to-date returns look a little bit better. I think the reality is if you look at their current yield, that will give you a little bit better impression on what actually they are generating in terms of real return. And then you will come closer to the kind of conclusion that we've come to, which is probably makes sense to just kind of continue to sit on the cash side of things. We're going to slide back to the phones. We've got Steve in Orlando with a question about Social Security. Good morning, Steve. How are you?
Good, Joel. I love listening to your program, and you give a lot of great advice.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
I just want to add a little comment to what you said before about the 35 years
Sure.
for Social Security, the average. That's correct, but it's not not quite correct. It's the 35 years that you made the most money.
Sure, 35 highest years. That's correct.
35 highest years. So, people who, like me, I'm retired. I work over 35 years.
Right.
Now I have a part-time job, and I make very little money. But that won't affect my Social Security because, I have 35 past years that are higher.
That is 100%. You're 100% correct on that, Steve, and I appreciate that clarification. It is 35. Is your high 35? It's not your last 35.
Okay, that's the only thing I wanted to comment on.
Yep. Nope. Great comment, and I certainly appreciate it. But yeah, and that means that if you had some zeros in there, okay, and obviously you don't, but if you had some zeros in there, then working the part-time job would help to replace those zeros and ultimately benefit. But if you sound like you've been working all your life, so you've got 50 years.
Yeah.
You got 50 years to pick from. So hopefully 35 of those 50 were some pretty good years.
Well, I'm quite 50, almost 50, but yes, right.
That makes sense. Thanks for that clarification.
Okay.
We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
All righty, sir. And that's a fair point. It is the 35 highest years, so you can kind of pick and choose which of those are your best ones. And so consequently, if you're working a part-time job, then those would not, sort of at the end of your work career, then those would not adversely impact that calculation. Fair point, Stephen. We appreciate that clarification. Also, the email that we had that we were going to answer from Michael, now that I've found it, here it is along this line of Social Security, but sort of a different sort of twist on it. And so Michael asks us, Joel, there are a couple of guys that are talking about ways to avoid federal tax on Social Security payments. They do not tell you how to do this. Apparently, this is on radio as well, or these folks are talking about this strategy on radio because they want you to go see them. Understandably, that's sort of how a lot of these programs work, unfortunately. Gone are the days when my father-in-law used to do this program, and it was the only program on the weekend, and it was all about information, not about giving out the office number and come see us and call us and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I digress. Now, back to the email from Michael. Now, because of pension and RMD income, I do get some of our Social Security income taxed. Yes, okay. Are there tricks I can pull with this income that will allow me to avoid the tax? I have a feeling what they are selling is annuities. Let's break that down into parts because that's a packed question. So, Social Security is taxed based upon how much other income you have. And at different thresholds, a higher amount of Social Security has to be included as taxable depending upon how much other income you have. So those thresholds start to kick in if you're a married couple at around like $34,000. If you're single, it's around $25,000. What happens is then there's a calculation, and it's like a 16-step calculation that determines how much of your Social Security then gets included, but it's a direct reflection of how much other income you have. So, Michael, in your case, if your income is RMD, which you can't avoid that, and that's taxable, and pension, which again is taxable and can't really avoid that, then there's no way to avoid the tax bite that you're getting on your Social Security. Now, if you had some flexibility, let's say you weren't taking your RMD because you were under 70 and a half, then you've got more flexibility if, for example, you use more of your non-IRA accounts, what we refer to as regular investment accounts or non-qualified accounts. Those types of accounts would be based upon you taking money out and only having to report the portion of that withdrawal that represents the overall gain in that particular position that you sold. So if you took $10,000, let's say the investment is a $100,000 investment, and it grew to $200,000. And you said, okay, I'm going to take $20,000. Well, if you use average cost basis, then of that $20,000, you'd really only have to report $10,000 as the gain on your taxes. So instead of having to report 20 and triggering more tax on your Social Security, you'd only have to report 10. And so consequently, that's a better scenario that you can at least do from a tax planning perspective. But again, that's only available if you're not subject to those RMD rules. Once you get subject to the RMD rules, then you can't really avoid that. I suspect that a lot of the conversation that you're hearing on these strategies to avoid tax on your Social Security is either going to take one of two different routes. One route would be the annuity or life insurance route, whereby if you put it all into a life insurance policy, then you can draw that money out tax-free as a loan. How you do that with qualified dollars, though, you really can't. So that doesn't necessarily solve your RMD problem. So the other part of the approach may be, hey, why don't you convert it all over to a Roth, and then you can take that out, and then that does not generate extra amount in terms of your Social Security being taxable, because that wouldn't generate an extra amount of income. The problem is that when you do that, guess what? You pay all the taxes then, which we're certainly not a fan of front-loading a huge chunk of taxes just to kind of avoid a little bit of a tax bill along the way. So I would hold off on that. But those are kind of the two strategies that could be floating around in the background out there, either an insurance strategy or a conversion strategy, neither of which we're particularly big fans of on their face. But we certainly appreciate that email from Michael and an opportunity to answer it as well. Also appreciate Dan and Steve calling into the program today as well. Good questions and good conversations across the board. If you missed any part of the show, guess what? Don't fear. We have it as a podcast. We put it up on the various social media channels. If you go to our website, Nelson Financial Planning, you'll find like a bunch of icons in the upper right-hand corner. Find one that looks familiar to you that you like, click on it, and poof, you'll get over to our podcast. If you want to see what we look like in living person, then you can go to our YouTube channel. That's Nelson Financial Planning. And our YouTube channel will have the video of the program starting tomorrow. So anyway, that's the show. We'll wrap it on up and get on out of here. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. Dollars and Cents here on News Radio WFLA Orlando.